Did you know that being ignored in childhood can affect your entire life? Find out how. There is a pain that does not leave purple marks, does not appear in old photographs, and almost never becomes a family affair. It is the pain of emotional neglect, the one that transforms an ignored child into an adult who learns, too soon, not to bother. Perhaps you know this feeling, walking into an environment and, even surrounded by people, feeling a strange chronic loneliness, as if your presence were optional. Psychology shows that this is not drama or lack of gratitude. It is an invisible, silent trauma that settles in child development and shapes deep beliefs about worthiness, love, and belonging. When emotional validation is lacking, an internalized neglect scheme is born, the constant expectation of rejection and fear of abandonment, even when nothing is actually happening. But here's the part that almost no one tells you: it can be reprogrammed. Thanks to neuroplasticity, the brain continues to learn, reorganize itself, and create new connections throughout life. There is a path to emotional healing, to rebuild low self-esteem and transform insecure attachment, John Bowlby attachment theory, into safer and more conscious relationships. Throughout this content, I will show you how this dynamic is formed, how it influences your relationships, and, above all, how to start breaking this cycle in a practical, possible, and real way. Because understanding the psychology behind the ignored child isn't about blaming the past. It's about finally taking control of the future. There is a truth that almost no one verbalizes: the ignored child does not suffer only for what happened, but mainly for what never happened. There was no listening, there was no mirroring, there was not that attentive pause of an adult saying, "I see you." This emotional neglect gradually teaches that feeling is exaggerated and needing is uncomfortable. And, without realizing it, the child begins to believe that attention is something that is earned, not something that is deserved. In child development, validation works as an emotional mirror. When it is lacking, a void is formed that is difficult to name, a true invisible trauma. The child learns to shrink, to speak less, to ask less, to occupy less space. And that's where the first draft of the internalized neglect scheme is born: if I'm not important, at least I won't be rejected. It seems like a smart strategy, but the price comes later, in the form of low self-esteem and chronic loneliness. If you identify with this, start by observing a simple detail. How do you react when someone doesn't respond to your message? Does anxiety rise fast? Does the old fear of abandonment arise? These signs are not weakness, they are echoes of an ancient story. A practical exercise is to write, every day, a little validation to yourself: what I felt today was legitimate. It sounds simple, but this practice is already beginning to introduce emotional validation where there was only silence before. When emotional neglect is repeated over time, it is no longer just an experience and becomes an internal structure. This is where the so-called internalized neglect scheme arises, an invisible lens through which the person begins to interpret the world. It doesn't matter if someone compliments, shows affection, or stays present. Deep down, there is the silent expectation that, sooner or later, rejection and fear of abandonment will come. The ignored child learns to anticipate inattention as a self-protection mechanism. She grows up with a hyperactive emotional radar, always trying to predict when she will be left aside. This pattern is deeply linked to insecure attachment, John Bowlby attachment theory, in which inconsistent attachment creates adults who oscillate between desperately seeking attention and pretending they don't need anyone. The problem is that this defense keeps chronic loneliness alive, even when there are people around. A practical step to start dismantling this scheme is to question automatic thoughts. When the idea "I'm not a priority" comes up, ask yourself, what's the real evidence of this now? Write down concrete situations that contradict this belief. It may seem like a detail, but this is how we start to use neuroplasticity to our advantage, creating new mental connections. It's not about denying the pain of the past, but making room for a different narrative, which sets the stage for the next layer of this story. When we talk about pain in childhood, many people only recognize what is wide-open screams, aggressions, severe punishments. But emotional neglect is sneaky. It doesn't leave bruises, it leaves doubts. The ignored child grows up hearing that he had it all, and begins to question his own perception. But the constant absence of emotional validation can be as devastating as any explicit abuse because it directly affects the construction of identity. Visible abuse breeds revolt, negligence breeds invisibility. In child development, when emotions are not welcomed, the child learns that feeling is wrong or useless. This strengthens the internalized neglect scheme, fueling low self-esteem and a persistent sense of not being enough. The result? An invisible trauma that the person himself has difficulty legitimizing, as if you were exaggerating for something that wasn't even that serious. If you've ever minimized your own pain with phrases like "it could have been worse," this may be an important sign. A simple exercise is to list moments in childhood when you needed emotional support and didn't receive it. Not to blame, but to acknowledge. This recognition is the first step of emotional healing. Because while the pain is not named, it continues to operate behind the scenes, especially in the patterns of rejection and fear of abandonment that we will see below. To understand why emotional neglect impacts so much, we need to look at the basis of human bonds. This is exactly what John Bowlby attachment theory brought to psychology: the idea that the way we are cared for early in life shapes our sense of security. When there is consistent presence in emotional validation, the child internalizes the message, "I am worthy of love." When there is absence, insecure attachment is born, and with it constant doubt about one's own worth. The ignored child does not cease to love his caregivers, he merely adapts his identity in order to survive. In child development, identity is built in the mirror of the other. If the other does not respond, the reflection is distorted. Then the internalized neglect scheme arises, which feeds low self-esteem and reinforces patterns of rejection and fear of abandonment. The person grows up trying to find out who they are, but always based on the reaction of others. A powerful exercise here is to observe how you react to emotional closeness. Do you get attached too quickly? Or do you walk away when someone starts to get closer? These are classic signs of insecure attachment. John Bowlby attachment theory still active. Reading works like Attached, by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller, can help you identify your pattern. Because understanding your attachment style isn't about putting a label on it, it's about gaining awareness to start rewriting your own story, step by step. Emotional neglect is not just a psychological experience, it also leaves marks on the brain. When the ignored child experiences repeated situations of affective absence, the body activates the alert system. Cortisol, the stress hormone, starts to circulate more frequently, preparing the mind for the worst. Over time, the brain learns to expect rejection and fear of abandonment as if they were inevitable events. In child development, the brain is in an intense phase of formation. Repeated experiences shape neural circuits, strengthening connections associated with threat. This is how invisible trauma sets in, not as a clear memory, but as a constant sense of tension. This programming contributes to low self-esteem, emotional hypervigilance, and that feeling of chronic loneliness, even when nothing is seemingly wrong. The good news? The same science that explains the impact also points the way to change. Neuroplasticity allows new experiences to reconfigure these circuits. Practices such as guided meditation, schema-focused therapy, and even deep breathing exercises help regulate the nervous system. Start with something simple: 5 minutes a day of slow breathing, inhaling in 4 beats and releasing in 6. It may sound basic, but you'll be teaching your brain that safety is possible, too, and that sets the stage for understanding the next stage of that journey. When we talk about emotional neglect, it is important to recognize something almost heroic: the child always finds a way to survive. The ignored child learns to adapt to the environment, even if it means silencing emotions or reducing needs. In child development, belonging is a matter of survival, so if to belong you have to shrink, she shrinks. And it does so with impressive efficiency. The problem is that this adaptation becomes identity. The internalized neglect scheme begins to dictate automatic behaviors: don't bother, don't overdo it, don't ask too much. Constant fear of rejection and fear of abandonment arises, fueling insecure attachment. John Bowlby attachment theory. The person grows up thinking that extreme independence is strength, when it is often just a strategy to not need the emotional validation that never came. Hey, race a practical reflection: in what situations do you avoid asking for help, even though you're overwhelmed? Try starting small. Ask for feedback on something simple or share a light difficulty with someone you trust. Observe the reaction. This exercise helps challenge the automatic belief that your needs drive people away. Because surviving was necessary back then. But today, to advance in emotional healing, it may be time to learn that you can take up space without losing belonging. When emotional neglect accompanies someone into adulthood, it doesn't appear with a sign saying "I'm here." She disguises herself. The ignored child grows up and develops sophisticated protection mechanisms: extreme independence, almost obsessive perfectionism, constant need for approval. All of this sounds like strength and sometimes even praise, but deep down, it may be the old scheme of internalized neglect trying to avoid further rejection and fear of abandonment. Perfectionism, for example, is often born out of the belief, if I'm flawless, no one will leave me. The search for approval works as a substitute for the emotional validation that was lacking in child development. But this race has no finish line. Low self-esteem is never completely satisfied, and the person may feel trapped in constant performance. It's exhausting, and feeds that chronic loneliness, even in the midst of achievements. A straightforward exercise: pick an area of your life where you tend to demand perfection and allow yourself to deliver something good enough. Notice the discomfort. It is the echo of insecure attachment. John Bowlby attachment theory in action. Instead of running away from it, breathe and stay. This is how we begin to weaken automatic patterns and make room for emotional healing. Because, deep down, you may not need to prove so much. Perhaps he just needs to allow himself to be. There is a kind of loneliness that does not depend on being alone in the room on a Saturday night. It can appear at a table full of friends, at a family gathering, or even in a stable relationship. The ignored child, marked by emotional neglect, grows up with the persistent feeling of not being fully seen. And so chronic loneliness is born not because of the absence of people, but because of the absence of internal connection. In child development, when emotional validation is lacking, the child learns to disconnect from his own emotions so as not to be frustrated. This shutdown becomes standard. The internalized neglect scheme whispers, even here, you don't really belong. And the result is that hard-to-explain emptiness, fueled by insecure attachment. John Bowlby attachment theory and the constant fear of abandonment, even when no one is leaving. A powerful practice is to start connecting with yourself before you seek external connection. Ask yourself, in social moments, what am I feeling right now? Name the emotion silently. It may sound simple, but this micro-attitude strengthens emotional awareness and activates neuroplasticity. You're training your brain to stay present. Because emotional healing often starts like this: not trying to be more interesting to others, but learning to be more present to yourself. If there is a place where emotional neglect usually reveals itself strongly, it is in love relationships. The ignored child grows up, but the emotional system remains sensitive to any sign of distance. An unanswered message, a different tone of voice, an unexpected silence all can activate the old fear of abandonment. It is insecure attachment, John Bowlby attachment theory, taking the wheel without asking permission. Some develop an anxious pattern. They need constant confirmation, seek emotional validation all the time, and feel distress when they don't receive it. Others go to the opposite extreme, adopting the avoidance style, feigning self-sufficiency, avoiding depth, and pulling away when the bond begins to get intimate. Both paths are responses to the same internalized neglect scheme, which learned back in child development that love can suddenly disappear. A practical exercise is to observe your pattern without judgment. When you feel discomfort in the relationship, do you tend to get too close or move away? Write down real situations of the week. This simple mapping already begins to weaken automatism and strengthens neuroplasticity, making room for more conscious choices. Because understanding your patterns isn't a sign of weakness, it's the first step in turning chronic loneliness into real connection, something we'll delve into in the next point. When emotional neglect happens early, it doesn't just affect feelings, it affects identity. The ignored child grows up without the mirroring necessary to understand who he is. In child development, we need someone to say, with words and attitudes, "I see you like this." Without this emotional validation, a fragile identity is formed, which depends excessively on external opinion to sustain itself. The internalized neglect scheme makes the person seek constant confirmation. Did I do well? Do you still like me? Is everything okay between us? This need is not an exaggerated need, it is a reflection of insecure attachment, John Bowlby attachment theory, and the old fear of abandonment. Low self-esteem feeds on this instability, creating a cycle where the approval of others becomes emotional fuel, but a fuel that runs out quickly. A transformative practice is to begin to build conscious self-mirroring. At the end of the day, write down 3 of your attitudes that you recognize as positive, even if no one noticed. This strengthens internal connections through neuroplasticity and initiates a real process of emotional healing. At first it may sound strange, almost forced, but little by little, you stop depending exclusively on the gaze of the other to know who you are, and this change prepares the ground for something even deeper that we will see below. If so far it seems that everything was programmed in childhood, take a deep breath. It is not a definitive sentence. Neuroplasticity proves that the brain continues to reorganize itself throughout life. This means that emotional neglect may have shaped circuits linked to fear, but consistent new experiences can create different paths. The old ignored child doesn't have to keep operating in survival mode forever. The internalized neglect schema weakens when we live relationships that offer repeated and predictable emotional validation. It can be in therapy, in a safe friendship, or even in small commitments that you fulfill with yourself. Each security experience adjusts the insecure attachment, John Bowlby attachment theory, reducing the intensity of rejection and fear of abandonment. It's like updating an old system that was full of emotional bugs. To enable this process, start by creating constancy micro-experiments. Establish a simple habit such as walking 3 times a week or keeping an emotional journal and stick to it for 30 days. It sounds basic, but consistency generates an internal sense of reliability. And this directly impacts low self-esteem and chronic loneliness. Reprogramming doesn't happen in a snap, it happens in conscious repetition, which brings us to the most decisive step in this journey. We come to an essential point. Emotional healing begins when you stop minimizing your history. Recognizing emotional neglect is not attacking the past. It is legitimizing the experience of the ignored child who still lives inside. While the invisible trauma is not named, it continues to operate silently, fueling low self-esteem, chronic loneliness, and the constant fear of abandonment. Self-validation is the daily practice of offering oneself what was lacking in child development: listening, respect, and welcoming. This does not eliminate insecure attachment, John Bowlby attachment theory, overnight, but it weakens the internalized neglect scheme. When you say "what I feel makes sense," you're creating new connections through neuroplasticity. This is how generational cycles begin to be broken, not with perfection, but with awareness. Point 1, final exercise: write a letter to your child's self. Tell her what she needed to hear. Reinforce that she wasn't exaggerated, difficult, or invisible. She was a child trying to be seen. Read this letter aloud. It may seem simple, even too symbolic, but symbols have power in the emotional system, and little by little, you realize that the validation you've sought in the world has always been able to start within you. Along this path, you may have recognized yourself at various points. Perhaps you have noticed how emotional neglect has silently shaped your choices, your relationships, and even the way you see yourself. But hey, raise the question that really matters: will you continue to live on the autopilot of the ignored child, or will you take control of your own story? Neuroplasticity reminds us that change is possible. Insecure attachment. John Bowlby. Attachment theory is not a sentence. The internalized neglect schema is not your ultimate identity, and low self-esteem is not who you are. It is just a reflection of past experiences. True emotional healing begins when you decide to validate your emotions, face the fear of abandonment, and build, little by little, more conscious relationships, including with yourself. So I ask you, what small attitudes can you start today to break this cycle? Where are you still waiting for external validation that you can start building internally? What patterns of chronic loneliness are you ready to turn into real connection? If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we talk about psychology in a deep, accessible, and transformative way, always with the goal of helping you understand your story and write a more conscious future.